Okay, I think we start.
Yes, good idea.
Yeah. Okay, so welcome to this third SAS webinar this spring. And the webinar today is sea ice and its impact on the Arctic Ocean. SAS, Synoptic Arctic Survey, is a researcher-driven effort for better data collection in the Arctic and the analysis of this data. So we focus on collection of high-quality data from research cruises. And the reason is that there's, some of the data we collect, we actually need to measure the data at sea in situ to obtain the quality that is required for scientific work. Many of the data we measure cannot be measured in any other way than at research cruises. And the aim is to achieve a complete coverage of the Arctic Ocean every 10 years through coordination of international sampling program. We cover physics, biogeochemistry, and biology and ecosystem. The first SAS was conducted over 2020 to 2022 and included about 20 or 25 cruises, Maite. Yes, correct. And the plan is to conduct another SAS in 2030. So a couple of years ahead of the International Polar Year 5. If you want to get involved in SAS and the planning, then please reach out to Maria Teresa or myself, and we can embed you in the effort. All right. Today we have 3 presentations from, I would say, early career scientists. The first one is Jakob Dörr in a minute. He will talk about present and future influence of heat transport on winter Arctic sea ice variability. Jakob is at University of Bergen. Then we have Zhangxian. He's at the University of Delaware in the US. He will talk about how sea ice loss amplifies the CO2 increase in the surface ocean and how it enhances ocean acidification. And the first speaker is Yuri Fukai. He's a postdoc at JAMSTEC in Japan. He will talk about the impact of sea ice dynamics on spatial distributions of diatoms in sediments of the Pacific Arctic region. So then the first man out is Jakob and on heat transport and winter Arctic sea ice variability. So Jakob, are you ready? Please share your screen.
Yes.
Nice.
Can you see my screen?
Yes. And now it's perfect in presentation mode. Thank you.
All right. Let me just get the pointer. All right. Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for letting me speak at this webinar. I'm going to present some of the work. So I'm a postdoc at the University of Bergen. I just started this year, and here I want to present some of the work that I've been doing during my PhD, where I was part of the Nansen Legacy project in Bergen. And it's going to be more of a modeling perspective on the present and future influence of ocean heat transport on winter Arctic sea ice variability. And I want to start with a time series of the total Arctic sea ice area in winter from November to March. And the black line is from satellite observations. And you can see that the sea ice in winter is decreasing in the Arctic. And we know that this long-term decrease is due to the increase in greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. So this is an externally forced decrease. But we also see a lot of variability from year to year and also over several years, up to decades. And this variability is what we call internal variability and is intrinsic to the climate system. And because it is overlaid on top of the externally forced sea ice loss, it induces a lot of uncertainty, not only for the next years, but also for the coming decades, because it is difficult to disentangle which of the changes have been due to internal variability and which have been due to the increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So it's important to understand the drivers and mechanisms of this internal variability, both now and in the future. And because it can be difficult to disentangle internal variability from the external forcing, in this talk, I will mostly be using these large ensemble simulations. And one of them you can see here, it's from the CESM large ensemble. Again, it's showing the sea ice area in winter. and it's forced in the future by this RCP 8.5, so it's a high emission scenario. And what's nice about these large ensembles is they're basically models that have been run multiple times with the same model and the same forcing, so that the only difference between each single simulation is due to internal variability. And this means that if you average over these members, you get rid of the internal variability and you are left with the external forced signal, which is this thick blue line here. And then if you remove this ensemble mean from each member, you are left with a pure internal variability, which you can then use to analyze. So this is just a pan-Arctic picture. You can also look at this a bit more regionally. So this is again from observations. This shows the variability in sea ice concentration, so the interannual variability. So the brighter the colors, the more variability in the sea ice concentration there is in winter. And you can see two hotspots based on the current, the last decades. The one is the Barents Sea on the Atlantic side, which is here. And the other one is in the Bering Sea. But you can also see some internal variability in early winter in the Chukchi Sea, north of the Bering Strait. And especially on the Atlantic side, we know that a lot of this internal variability is driven by ocean heat transport. So it transports warm Atlantic waters into the Arctic, which can then melt the sea ice or inhibit the freezing of sea ice. And so in the Atlantic side, we have Atlantic water entering the Barents Sea to the Barents Sea opening and also entering the Arctic via Fram Strait. And both of these heat transports have been used to predict sea ice, winter sea ice in the Barents Sea several years ahead. But there's also the Bering Strait on the Pacific side, which brings in relatively warm Pacific water, which can also, or has been used to predict the sea ice advance in early winter in the Chukchi Sea. But now is the question, as the sea ice will continue to decrease in winter, how will this influence of the ocean heat transport change in the future? And this is where I'll use these large ensembles to kind of look into the future. If we use the CSM large ensemble and we repeat this map for the future, this is a future period towards the end of the 21st century, we can see that as the sea ice edge retreats towards the Central Arctic, we see an increase in the variability in the winter sea ice concentration on the Pacific and on the Atlantic side. So then it's the question, how will this be influenced by the ocean heat transports from the Atlantic and the Pacific? And to do this, what we calculate is the correlation between the heat transports through these three gates, Barents Sea opening, Fram Strait, and Bering Strait, and then we correlate it with the following winter sea ice concentration. And here this map is from reanalysis and observations, and it shows you the areas, the contours show you the regions where sea ice concentration is highest correlated with the ocean heat transport. So the green area is influenced by the Bering Strait ocean heat transport, and then this is mostly in the Chukchi Sea. Then the blue area, it's the Barents Sea, which is influenced by the Barents Sea opening heat transport, and then we have the Fram Strait heat transport in yellow lines here, which is also correlated with the sea ice concentration in the Barents Sea. And we can repeat this now with, we did this for several of these large ensembles, both from CMIP phase 5 and CMIP phase 6. So in total, we have 7 large ensembles. And this is the same analysis, and they all show this influence of the Bering Strait on the Chukchi Sea in the current period, and then influence from the Barents Sea opening and the Fram Strait onto the Barents Sea and the Atlantic side. Although there are already quite a lot of model differences, as you see. But now we can use these large ensemble to project this into the future. So this is now for, again, this period towards the second half of the 21st century, all run under a high emission scenario. And now the solid contour lines show the regions which are most correlated to these heat transports in the future. And for the Bering Strait, again, these green areas, you can see that in most of these models, the area which is influenced by Bering Strait heat transport is expanding towards the future, towards the Central Arctic and as well as the East Siberian seas. And this is kind of seen in most models, although the degree of expansion is a bit differing among models. What you also see, the blue areas for the Barents Sea opening, this is also expanding in some of the models quite far towards the Central Arctic. But you also have models where this expansion is quite weak. So there's a bit of model differences here, but they all agree on this moving northward of the area, which is most influenced by the Barents Sea opening heat transport. And then finally, the Fram Strait has the least future influence in all of these models. So I will mostly focus now in the following on the influence of the Bering Strait, the green, and the Barents Sea opening. And we can also quantify the total influence a bit more by, instead of correlating the sea ice concentration, instead correlating the total sea ice area on both sides of the Arctic. So the Pacific side with the Bering Strait and the Atlantic side with the Barents Sea opening. And this is what I've done here, basically. So the left plot shows the correlation over time between the Barents Sea opening heat transport and the sea ice area in this blue shaded area on the Atlantic side. And the colors are the different models, and the star is from the reanalysis. And you can see that in all of the models, this correlation goes down over time as the sea ice edge moves further away from the Barents Sea opening. So we have an expansion, but we also have a total weakening of the total influence. For the Bering Strait, most of these models also show a decreasing influence on sea ice area on the Pacific side. However, in some models, this stays quite constant over time, as possibly this retreating sea ice edge is compensated by this large expansion of the signal, this regional expansion. And also in these two plots, you see quite a lot of model differences. And we wanted to understand a bit more where these model differences came from, because then they can then be used to constrain a bit what will actually happen in the future with the influence of the heat transports from the Pacific and the Atlantic. So what we did is we always used this measure, which is this correlation between ocean heat transport and the sea ice area, and we related it to different mean quantities in the models and model properties. And we start with the mean sea ice cover, so the mean sea ice area, basically. So what I'm showing here on this plot is now again this correlation on the y-axis. This hasn't changed, but now on the x-axis you see the mean sea ice area over the run in these different models. So each dot now represents one model. Again, the black star is the reanalysis, and the whiskers basically show you the spread over time. But if you look at this, you don't really see a strong connection. So it's not like the models with the lowest sea ice cover show the weakest connection. Instead, the differences in the mean sea ice cover cannot really be used to constrain any future influence of the heat transport onto the sea ice area on the Atlantic side. And it's a bit similar for the Pacific side, although you can imagine that some models that have more sea ice cover show a bit higher influence of the Bering Strait heat transport onto the sea ice. However, still the connection is quite weak. So the mean sea ice cover cannot really be used to constrain differences in the models when it comes to the future influence of the ocean heat transport. We also looked at the heat transport, so the mean heat transport across the gates. Again, for the Atlantic side, now the x-axis is now the mean heat transport through the Barents Sea opening into the Arctic. And again, you can see that there's not really a clear connection here. That's it's not like models with a higher heat transport have a stronger connection, or vice versa. And the same is also a bit true on the Pacific side. So there's not a really strong connection, although there is one model that has the highest influence of the Bering Strait heat transport, which also has the highest heat transport. But in general, there's not a strong connection between the model differences. So the heat transport can be decomposed into the volume flux and the mean inflow temperature. And we also looked at both of these metrics to possibly constrain the difference in the influence. For the Atlantic side, again, we see that neither the volume transport nor the inflow temperature can really explain any differences in the influence. But for the Pacific side, you can see that the volume transport can explain some of the differences, that models which have a higher volume transport, so a stronger water flow into the Bering Strait, have a stronger influence of the Bering Strait heat transport onto the sea ice area, whereas the inflow temperature also doesn't play a role. And then lastly, for the mean oceanic properties, we also, for the Atlantic side, looked at the variance of the inflow. So this is basically how strong the heat volume transport and the temperature varies from year to year. And this seems to be important for the Atlantic side. So models that have a higher year-to-year variance or variability of the inflow properties, they show a higher influence of these waters onto the sea ice. So this seems to be important for the Atlantic side. And then lastly, we looked at the vertical stratification, because the stratification is kind of very important in possibly inhibiting any heat from the Atlantic or the Pacific layers to propagate and mix upward to the surface and influence the sea ice. So what we use to estimate the stratification, we use the metric that is derived from the total energy it takes to mix the upper ocean completely. So the higher this value, the stronger the upper ocean stratification is. And here is basically showing this, the mean value of this stratification estimate. In the panel A, the top left, you see the estimate from reanalysis. And you can see that generally the stratification is highest in the Beaufort Gyre, where we have this accumulation of fresh water. And then it generally decreases towards the Atlantic side and the Eurasian basin. And you also have some stratification over the inflow shelves. So this is the white area here is the Barents Sea, and the white area here is the southern Chukchi Sea, which is where the Pacific waters and the Atlantic waters enters the Arctic Ocean and meets the sea ice. And here you have some stratification, but it's generally lower than in the Central Arctic. And if you now compare the models, they're all over the place, basically, in terms of stratification in the Central Arctic. So none of these models really captures this difference between the Pacific and the Atlantic side. And also, if you look at the inflow shelves, which we are most interested here, they are also all over the place. Some show a stronger stratification than reanalysis. Some show a completely mixed shelf. So there's lots of model differences here. And now we try to relate some of these model differences in stratification, again, to the influence of the ocean heat transport. So again, for the Atlantic side, what I'm now plotting on the x-axis is the stratification strength in the Barents Sea. And you can see, again, there's not really a connection. You can imagine that models that have a low stratification tend to have a higher influence of the Atlantic Ocean heat transport onto the sea ice, which would be expected because if you have a less stratification, then the Atlantic waters are more easily mixed up to the surface layer. However, the connection is not really that strong. For the Pacific side, however, we do see a connection, but it's the opposite way around. So we see that models with a higher stratification on the southern Chukchi shelf, or the inflow shelf, have a stronger influence of the Bering Strait ocean heat transport onto the sea ice, which at first sight is counterintuitive because, again, you would expect higher stratification to be the surface to be more, or the Pacific waters for them to be more difficultly mixed up to the surface and influence the sea ice. So we wanted to investigate this a bit more, and this is why we looked at vertical sections from the Bering Strait onto the Chukchi shelf. So basically, we looked at these vertical sections here. Here is Bering Strait. This is towards the north along the Chukchi shelf. And we looked at temperature and salinity in early winter, which is exactly when the sea ice is advancing southward towards the Bering Strait. And in this reanalysis product in early winter, you see the clear warm and salty signal coming from the Bering Strait. So this subsurface signal, which can be identified as the Pacific waters. But then if you look at some of these models, so now we took the model that has the highest stratification, which is this blue model, and the model that has the lowest stratification. The model with the highest stratification also shows this subsurface warm and salty signal, which we can identify it as a Pacific water layer. However, this model that has no stratification basically just has a completely mixed shelf and very fresh shelf. So we cannot really identify any subsurface signal of Pacific water. So this might be something that these models that can accurately capture a distinct inflowing Pacific water, they tend to have a higher influence and more consistent with reanalysis influence of Pacific water or Bering Strait heat transport onto the sea ice. And this is why another metric you can use to constrain this is the bottom salinity at the Bering Strait. So the higher this bottom salinity in the models, which kind of shows this distinct saltier Pacific water layer, the more influence these models show for the Bering Strait heat transport. Okay, so to summarize this quickly, this first part, we see this northward expanding influence of the Atlantic and Pacific heat transport onto the sea ice in all of these large ensembles models. And we looked a bit at the differences, and on the Atlantic side, the most important difference seems to be this variance of the inflows. The models with a higher variance from year to year show a higher influence. And on the Pacific side, the volume transport is important, but also the stratification and vertical mixing and representation of this Pacific subsurface layer seems to be important in explaining some of these model differences. And now for the last part, I very quickly, if I have time, want to go over another project that we've done over the PhD, and which was now focused on the Barents and Kara seas, because so the heat transport influences the sea ice, but it's not the only driver of sea ice variability. The atmosphere also plays a large role, and it's not really clear what the relative importance of the atmosphere or the ocean in driving variability is. And we wanted to investigate this on the Atlantic side. So here, this is the Barents and Kara seas, which we show here the sea ice area, similar to what we've shown before. Black is from observations, and the blue lines are from the CSM large ensemble. And then we have the ocean heat transport. And now we also look at the atmospheric temperature as a potential driver of the sea ice variability, and also at the sea surface temperature. And in CSM, if you just look at the correlations between all of these variables, so this is the sea ice area, atmospheric temperature is correlated significantly with the sea ice area. So black boxes mean significant correlations, but so is the SST and the ocean heat transport. They're all correlated significantly, but they're also correlated with each other. So it's very difficult to actually disentangle which has the highest causal influence on the sea ice area. And this is why in this work we used a causal method called the rate of information transfer, which looks at the covariance between all of these variables and also takes into account lags, and it tries to estimate a magnitude and direction of causal influence between variables. So what you see in this matrix now, based on CSM again, is the influence from these variables onto the top variables. So for example, the atmospheric temperature has a significant influence in the model onto the sea ice area, and so does the ocean heat transport, where the SST does not have a significant causal influence. And according to this model, in the 20th century, the ocean heat transport has the highest direct causal influence onto the sea ice area. But if we now look at the second period in CSM, the 21st century, now we see that the influence of the atmosphere becomes stronger and actually becomes the strongest direct influence onto the sea ice area, whereas the ocean heat transport influence decreases, which is also in line with what I showed you before about this weakening influence as the sea ice retreats further northwards. So we have more details in this paper, but this was just a very small sneak peek. So to conclude this side, the ocean heat transport is the main causal driver, at least in this CSM large ensemble for the recent past. However, the atmosphere is becoming more important and the most important driver in the future on the Atlantic side. And with that, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Jakob. Very nice. So it's question time. So please raise your hand if you have questions, or you can also type them in the chat. Okay, I can maybe start with a question, Jakob. So you looked at the winter sea ice, it governs that variability there. So what about the summer sea ice? Is that only a consequence of the winter sea ice again, or are there other factors also which might influence the extent of summer ice?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is some limited influence of ocean heat transport and winter sea ice cover onto the summer sea ice. However, according to most research, the atmospheric influence is really dominating in summer. So the summer sea ice variability is really dominated by the atmosphere.
Okay, thank you. And now we have a question from Patricia. Go ahead.
Hi, Jakob.
Hey.
Great talk. This
Thanks.
is really interesting results. I just wonder if you could clarify. I'm kind of struggling with this concept that the influence of the inflow is expanding spatially, but is kind of weakening in total. So is it and especially like on this figure here, you can see the correlation lines that you're showing the 0.4 that is the same. So is it just that it's reaching further, but the correlation is weaker overall? I'm not kind of struggling with that concept.
So if you look locally, for example, for a point in the Central Arctic, the correlation with the heat transport will increase. So it's basically more. So the expansion refers to more regions being stronger correlated than before to the heat transport. But if you look at the total correlation, so if you kind of by correlating with the sea ice area, it kind of integrates the total influence. This becomes weaker. So at points that are already correlated now with the sea ice, they will all become weaker in the future, if that makes sense. So it's kind of the expansion refers to this more regions becoming correlated with the heat transport, but still overall the total influence is weaker. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
I think you're muted.
Are, you are muted.
Thank you, Mate. We have a question from Sophia Carey in the chat. Sophia, do you want to read it out yourself or should I read it? I can go ahead. So Jakob, have you also considered data on the variability of atmospheric temperature on land, for example, on Svalbard, so I guess, and whether the sea ice extent in winter is influenced also, you know, looking at actual data from land stations around the Arctic?
For the second project, no. So we chose to use the temperature at 850 hectopascal because the problem if you use surface temperature, they are very heavily correlated with the sea ice area. So this is why we chose to use upper atmosphere, or not upper, but like above the boundary layer temperatures. And we have also compared these results from CSM with results from the analysis, but we have not compared it with actual station data. Yeah.
Is that something you plan to do or?
No, no. So it is already difficult to use reanalysis data because this method needs a lot of data for it to produce significant results. So this is one reason why we chose to use these large ensemble, because they provide us with many members that we can use to sample it.
Yeah. Maybe a comment, or a question. I think these large ensembles are really interesting and provides a lot of nice information. And I think they could maybe be useful for understanding the future biogeochemistry also. Do you know if some of these models has the biogeochemical component also, nutrients, carbon cycle, or are they physics only? Do you know?
I'm not an expert here, but I think probably some people in this call know better, but I think some of the models have biogeochemical modules. I'm not sure if they have been run as part of the large ensemble.
No.
I'm not sure.
That would be nice. Okay, we have a question from Anastasia in the chat for you, Jakob. I can read it out. Could you repeat again main factors for Barents Kara region in past, now, and in future? As one.
Yeah, sorry. I can. So for the recent past, according to this one large ensemble, we looked at the most important direct influence factor is the ocean heat transport, especially for the Barents Sea, central Barents Sea. And then if you move towards the future, the atmosphere will become the strongest driver, especially because it's the strongest driver in the northern Barents Sea and the Kara Seas. But that, of course, is only one large ensemble. But yeah, these are the main factors. And then I didn't mention, but the atmosphere is not the largest direct driver, but it still has an indirect influence, which is something we also found. So it indirectly influences sea ice by influencing the ocean heat transport. But the main direct driver is the ocean heat transport in the recent past.
And then the second question from Anastasia is, did you only use 850 hectopascal temperature as atmospheric influence?
Yeah, so we also used in the beginning the 2-meter temperature, but the problem there it's very highly correlated with sea surface temperature and thereby also the sea ice. So it was a bit difficult to disentangle the direction of influence, and this is why for the atmospheric influence we chose to use the atmospheric temperature above the boundary layer, basically.
Yeah. Okay. Then I think we move on to those who are curious. Jakob has quite a few papers out in the literature. I think some of them were, mentioned in the announcement for the meeting. So I encourage everyone to take a look at those. And thank you again, Jakob. Very nice. We move on to Zhangxian, Ouyang, University of Delaware. He will talk about sea ice loss and how it amplifies decadal surface CO2 increase and enhances ocean acidification in the Western Arctic Ocean. So, Zhangxian, are you ready?
Yes, let me share my screen. Can you
Yes.
see my screen, Glenn?
Yes, very nice. Please go ahead.
Thank you for your introduction. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Zhangxian Ouyang. I'm a postdoc working with Dr. Weijing Cai and Yun Li at the University of Delaware. I have been working on the Arctic carbon cycle research for a couple of years, and I'm very glad to present our recent study on how the sea ice loss amplifies decadal surface CO2 increase and enhances the ocean acidification in the Western Arctic Ocean. This is the outline for my presentation today. I will start by briefly introducing the several striking ongoing changes in the Arctic. And then I will focus on the inorganic carbon cycle changes at the Arctic surface water today, including the long-term trend of the partial pressure of CO2, PCO2, pH, and the saturated state of the aragonite, aka omega. And I will talk about the CO2 sink changes as well. And finally, I will talk about how the sea ice loss affected the Arctic Ocean surface acidification. As many of you know, the Arctic is one of the most vulnerable and sensitive regions on Earth in response to the climate change. Since the 1980s, the Arctic temperature increasing more than 2 times faster than the global average, which is known as the Arctic amplification. As a consequence, the Arctic summer sea ice has decreased by more than 35% for the same period. The trend of the warming and the sea ice loss are likely to continue in the next few decades because the ice albedo feedback. As the sea ice melts, it exposes the darker open water, which absorbs more heat from the sun, and this increased absorbed heat will lead to the further ice melting, creating a feedback loop that will accelerate the Arctic warming and the sea ice loss. Many climate models already predicted that the Arctic Ocean will become an ice-free Arctic in the next decade, as early as the 2030s. The warming and the sea ice loss as the two main drivers also has a substantial impact on the terrestrial ecosystem. One direct consequence is the permafrost thawing and the coastal erosion. Study has shown that the annual erosion rate along the Alaska and the Canadian and the Siberian coast can be as high as 20 meters per year. Furthermore, the permafrost thawing and the coastal erosion has many important climate and biogeochemical impact. For example, the greenhouse gases, methane and the CO2 can be released from the soil to the atmosphere, and the soil organic carbon and the nutrients stored into the permafrost that can be released to the nearshore region, which may further enhance the ocean primary production and the sediment flux. In terms of the Arctic Ocean prime production, a recent model study has quantified that the nutrient flux from the river and the coastal erosion can contribute a 1/3 annual prime production. As you can see from this figure on the left, the land-derived nutrients are more critical in supporting the net prime production in the Arctic shelf space. On the other hand, using the remote sensing-based product, the researchers have found that the prime production in the Arctic Ocean has increased by 57% between 1989 and 2018. They suggested that the sea ice loss with a higher light availability was responsible for the first period, for the first decade. And the increase in the biomass, basically the chlorophyll A increase, is responsible for the increase in net prime production for the second period. And you can see from this figure, the largest increase in chlorophyll A was measured on the inflow shelf. For example, the Zhangxian Sea and the Bergen Sea, which is due to the increased nutrient supply from the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Okay, now you must realize that Arctic Ocean is a climate sensitive and a highly dynamic region. And our research is focused on how these environmental changes substantially affect the Arctic carbon cycle. And this map shows our study area, the Western Arctic Ocean. And I think this is a very good observational window for examining how the changes in carbon cycle in different regimes. For example, it's consistent with inflow gateway shelf, the Zhangxian shelf, a river influenced the interior marginal sea, the Baltic Sea here, and oligotrophic deep basin, the Canada Basin. And I use this diagram to simply illustrate the physical and the biogeochemical setting in this region. And I also list the three major environmental changes during the past few decades. The first is the Western Arctic Ocean is the one of the region which has experienced the most dramatic sea ice loss in the past few decades. The summer sea ice edge has retreated from the shelf break in the early 1990s into the central Canada Basin in the recent years. And another substantial change is that the annual Pacific inflow. The researchers found that this annual Pacific inflow has increased by more than 50% between 1990s and 2019. This increased inflow brings much more nutrients onto the Zhangxian shelf, resulting in a net prime production increase by 96% between 1998 and 2018. We care about these changes because they are all tightly linked to the scientific question we want to address here. As the sea ice retreat and the sea ice losses, can the Arctic Ocean absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere to mitigate the global warming? In other words, is the Arctic Ocean an increasing CO2 sink? Before I talk about the data, I would like to briefly introduce some fundamental concept here. In organic carbon research, we use PCO2, the partial pressure of the CO2, as indicator to indicate the CO2 concentration in the seawater or in the air. And the difference between these two parameters is defined as delta PCO2. If the delta PCO2 is less than 0, that means the ocean will pick up the CO2 from the atmosphere, and this area is a CO2 sink. If the delta PCO2 is larger than 0, that means the CO2 molecule will get out from the ocean, and this is a CO2 source. However, in the Arctic Ocean, this process becomes more complicated because the sea ice actually acts as a mechanistic barrier to the gas exchange and the light penetration. And this is why there are two competing hypotheses regarding the CO2 sink changes in the Arctic Ocean. The early study expected the Arctic Ocean will become a larger CO2 sink in the future, because they believe as the sea ice melt, the CO2 more area become ice-free, which facilitates a stronger CO2 uptake. On the other hand, without the sea ice, the light become more available, which will stimulate the stronger prime production and the stronger biological CO2 drawdown. Both processes will lead to a larger CO2 sink. However, recent observation found that the Arctic Ocean has a limited CO2 uptake capacity. They argue that the sea ice melt can strengthen the top ocean stratification, limits the nutrient supply from the subsurface, and without the continuous nutrient supply, the biological CO2 drawdown cannot last for a long time. And on the other hand, the stratified top surface layer is easily warming up, and both process result in a smaller delta PCO2, which indicates a limited CO2 sink. To resolve these two competing hypotheses, we studied by compiling the historical PCO2 data in our study area, and this animation will give you an idea about how many data points we got from each year and the distribution, how the distribution looks like. You can see the white area is an ice-covered area, and in the early period, most observations were made on the shelf area. And in the recent years, when the sea ice retreat into the Canada Basin, the Central Basin, we have a more observation here. And you can also see that from this data density plot, you can see we have more data observed on the shelf, the Zhangxian shelf in the coastal region, and much less observation in the Central Canada Basin and the higher latitude area. From a temporal distribution perspective, you can also see that most observations are made during the summer months, from July to October, November. Therefore, we confirm our study period to the summer season because we don't have much observation from the winter and the spring. Once we overlay all the data points together, a unique spatial distribution pattern appears here. We have lower PCO2 on the Zhangxian shelf and the higher PCO2 in the Canada Basin. And you can see that there is a very clear low to high transition front along the 250-meter isobas along the shelf break here. And you may ask, why is that? And what is the control mechanism here? And we attribute this contrasting PCO2 spatial distribution pattern to the influence of the different water masses. On the Zhangxian shelf, the Pacific inflow water dominates, and it brings the much more nutrients and supporting the strong prime production there. The strong prime production will draw down the CO2 and keep the surface PCO2 low. However, this Pacific inflow water does not directly go across the shelf break. It either turns to the west or to the east or subducted into the subsurface. That means this low PCO2 water does not influence the surface water in the Canada Basin. In contrast, in the Canada Basin, the meltwater with the river discharge occupies the surface layer here. So this shows a different PCO2. It shows a higher PCO2 there. Based on this distribution map, we examined the long-term trend of the PCO2 separately for the Chukchi Sea and the Canada Basin, and we found that the PCO2 on the Chukchi Shelf does not change very much from 1994 to 2017. In contrast, we observed a significantly increased trend in the Canada Basin. The increase rate is about 4.6 microatmosphere per year, which is more than 2 times faster than the atmospheric CO2 rise. If this trend continues, you can see that the PCO2, the difference between the air and the seawater PCO2 will decrease and will reduce to near zero in 2030s. That means at that time, the Canada Basin may not take the CO2 from the atmosphere anymore. A following question arises here: why the PCO2 in the Canada Basin increased so fast? And we want to go one more further step to identify the driver and quantify their contributions. So we decomposed the PCO2 changes into 2 components. One is the thermal component, which is driven by the changes of long-term changes of the SST, the surface temperature, and the non-thermal component, which is driven by the long-term changes in the other factors like dissolved inorganic carbon, DIC, and the total alkalinity and the sea surface salinity. And we found that the non-thermal component actually can contribute the most of the increase in PCO2. It's contribute about 88% of the total increase trend. And then we proposed a mechanism of the synergistic effect of the sea ice melting, warming, and the CO2 uptake to explain this decadal PCO2 increase. And you can see this mechanism from this figure. Compared to 1990s, the melting water in the 2010s dilute the surface water and give it a lower initial PCO2. Without ice cover, this lower PCO2 will lead to a large CO2 uptake, which will lead to a large DIC increase. At the same time, the warming effect indicated by this red arrow can amplify the PCO2 seasonal variation. Together, all 3 processes can lead to a rapid PCO2 increase, decadal increase. Okay, let's get back to the question at the beginning. So far, we haven't fully addressed that question. Is the Arctic Ocean increasing CO2 sink? To answer this question, the biggest challenge is the observational data are very limited in the Arctic Ocean. As I mentioned before, the most observations are conducted on the shelf region and measured during the summer months. We barely have the observation during the winter and the spring. So to overcome this challenge and answer the question, we conducted the 3 complementary approaches to estimate the Western Arctic Ocean CO2 sink changes. The first approach is the observational data-based estimation, we're using a upscaling method to see how the limited observation data can help us. And the second approach is we conducted a simple box model, only consider the surface mix layer, but we have a much better data coverage. And the third approach is we use machine learning algorithm to reconstruct the CO2 map. And this is an ongoing project. I won't talk much today, but I do want to show the results from the first two approaches. This is the results. The red line is an observation-based estimation, and the red line is a modeled results. And you can see we didn't see a significant increasing or decreasing trend in CO2 sink in both the Sea and the Canada Basin, but we found a significant increase CO2 sink in the Chukchi Sea. As I explained before, this is mainly due to the increased net prime production, which lead to a stronger biological CO2 drawdown and got a increase the CO2 sink here. Adding up these three sub-region, the figure shows the total CO2 sink changes for the entire Western Arctic Ocean from 1994 to 2019. And based on this result, the take-home message here is our current knowledge is the Western Arctic Ocean is a slightly increasing CO2 sink, but its size, the carbon sink size may be limited and may decrease in future. The story doesn't end here. The increased CO2 in the seawater will lead to another environmental consequences, thus ocean acidification. The CO2 molecule dissolved into the water and form the carbonic acid, decreased pH and omega. And this process indeed happened in the Arctic Ocean. Taking advantage of our synthesized data sets, we examined the long-term trend of the pH and omega in the Western Arctic Ocean, the surface water, and we found that the increased CO2 at the surface result in unprecedented surface acidification in the Canada Basin. From 1994 to 2020, pH and omega decreased rates are 3 to 4 times faster than the other open ocean basins. The Arctic, that means the Arctic Ocean is experiencing the severest surface acidification in the past few decades. And more interestingly, we found that a stronger linear relationship between the summer sea ice extent and the pH and omega in the Canada Basin. And we proposed a mechanism called the ice melting driven acidification to explain this such as fast Arctic surface acidification. Simply speaking, the ice melting water lowers the buffer capacity of the surface water and make it more vulnerable to any DIC addition. Considering the summer surface layer is very shallow and strongly stratified, a small amount CO2 added into the surface layer can lead to a very large pH and omega decrease. Last but not least, I want acknowledge our many of our collaborators and co-authors for this study. And I also want to acknowledge the funding source for supporting the studies. Thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Zhangxian. Please, people, raise your hand if you have any questions. I can start with a question. Just hang on a bit there, Shigeto. So Zhangxian, do you know if there are plans to do more winter measurements in the Arctic Ocean, as these are quite scarce? Do you...
Could you please repeat your question again?
Yeah, you showed that the winter measurements of CO2 in the Arctic Ocean was quite scarce. And do you know if there are plans to conduct more winter measurements?
No, like I feel that is very challenge because because the sea ice in winter, it's really hard for like the underway measurement to access the region there. But I expected that in the future maybe there are some like the mooring or a buoy, like the TOP, the ice asset, the profile. If they can attach the like a CO2 sensor there, maybe we can observe the winter PCO2 measurements.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Shiga.
Okay, thank you. Your interesting talk. I have a question about the surface PCO2 in the Zhangxian. Based on your talk, PCO2 would be reduced by the biological activity, primary productivity reduce the PCO2, but in the Zhangxian, northern part of the Zhangxian PCO2 was lower than the southern part, but the primary productivity is higher in the southern part. How to explain such a, how to explain why a PCO2 is lower in the northern part in spite of low primary productivity?
Okay, let me share the screen. Let me share the screen again. I think you are talking about this slide.
Yeah, this right.
This one, right?
Yeah, this one.
In the northern Chakchi Sea, we have a relatively lower PCO2, and in the southern part, we have a higher PCO2. And you mentioned that in the southern part, we have a stronger biological activity.
Yeah.
Right. And I think this is the short answer is in the southern part, because the water mass, especially for the eastern Chakchi Sea, is dominant by the warmer Alaska coastal current. It has a higher temperature there. Even we have the source water has the same PCO2 level, but when the water is warming up, it will driving the PCO2 higher. So on this region, especially along the coastal area, we observe the very high, relatively high PCO2. And another reason is the river discharge, like a Yukon River, the river discharge may also contribute the higher PCO2 in this coastal area. But once this water moves northward into the northern Chakchi Sea, I believe the water source is most of the water in this area is the saltier and the cooler Bering Sea water is coming from like a central channel and reach to this area.
Okay, I understand. So, in the northern part, lower temperature decrease PCO2, and is that increase PCO2 absorption? Not for biological activity, but for the low temperature water dissolution, increase CO2 absorption into the ocean?
Yes, like how much the CO2 can be uptake from the atmosphere, that is determined by the difference between the TCO2 gradient between the sea and the air. If we have a large delta PCO2, the gradient is larger, that indicate a stronger CO2 uptake.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any more questions for Zhangxian? Please raise your hand or write them in the chat. No, then I think we move on, Zhangxian. Thank you again for a very nice and interesting presentation. We move on to the next speaker, which is Yuri Fukai from JAMSTEC.
Hi.
Hi, Yuri. So please
Hi.
share your screen and go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it looks good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Yuri Fukai. I'm a postdoc in JAMSTEC. I usually working on the phytoplankton in the Arctic. And today I'd like to present my previous study entitled Impact of Sea Ice Dynamics on the Spatial Distribution of Diatom in Sediment of the Pacific Arctic region. Sorry. One of my study interests is how phytoplankton respond to environmental changes in the Arctic. And in the study I will present today, I try to understand the impact of changes in sea ice dynamics on the phytoplankton community by examining the archive records of diatoms in sediments. My study was conducted on the very regional area. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our study area, which is the Pacific Arctic region. This Pacific Arctic region is the Pacific side gateway of the Arctic and extends from the northern Bering Sea to the Zhangxian and Beaufort Seas, with large shallow shelf region. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. The northern Bering and Zhangxian Seas show high daily rates of primary production and thus high sinking flux of particulate organic carbon. Since benthic community use the sufficient particulate organic carbon, the shallow Pacific Arctic shelf is characterized by tight benthic pelagic coupling and is called benthic biological hotspots. In contrast, primary productivity in southwestern Beaufort Sea is known to relatively low as compared with those in the northern Bering and Zhangxian Seas. The Pacific Arctic region is also characterized by seasonal sea ice cover, which varies every year in terms of extent, thickness, and duration. As all of you know, a significant decrease in the amount of sea ice has been reported from the Pacific Arctic region. Phytoplankton assemblages are influenced by sea ice dynamics. Therefore, the biophysical interactions in Pacific Arctic should be further investigated. Phytoplankton assemblages in the Pacific Arctic region are dominated by diatoms, especially during spring and summer blooms. These diatoms have an interesting life strategies, that is, resting stages. Under unfavorable growth conditions such as low nutrient, many diatom species can produce resting stages, which are similar to the seeds of the higher plants. These diatom resting stages tend to sink due to an increase in weight with the sinking of the fruit tube or cell aggregation, and they finally accumulate in bottom sediments. Therefore, the distribution of the viable diatoms in sediment may reflect the extent and magnitude of their previous bloom in the water column and serve as archive records of them. So in this study, to understand the impact of sea ice dynamics on diatom communities during bloom season in the Pacific Arctic, we try to estimate diatom assemblages during bloom from the viable diatom assemblages in sediment and comparing their distribution to sea ice coverage. It's a quick material and methods. We collected sediment sampled in the northern Bergen, Zhangxian, and southwestern Beaufort Sea through 3 research cruises. And after then, using the surface sediment at the 48 station, we quantified the viable diatom using the most probable number method. And also, we obtained the satellite-based sea ice concentration data to define the environmental factors. In these studies, we defined 2 factors related to sea ice dynamics. First is timing of the sea ice retreat, TSR, which decided as last day when the sea ice concentration fell below 20% prepared to the observed annual sea ice minimum across the study region during summer. Second is growing periods of the ice-associated diatoms, GP, which was defined as the integrated day lengths during the periods with higher than 20% of the ice concentration after the daylight exceed 10 hours. This is one of the results, and this figure shows the diatom concentrations in sediment. As indicated in this figure, viable diatom concentrations ranged over 4 orders of magnitude across the study area. We found a clear spatial gradient of the viable diatom concentrations, that is higher concentrations in the northern Bergen and Zhangxian seas, but low concentrations in the Beaufort seas. It appears that the spatial patterns of diatom concentrations in sediment were generally consistent with those of primary production reported previously. Next, this figure shows diatom community groups classified by cluster analysis. When the colors the same, which means the community was similar. By the cluster analysis, diatom community and segments were mainly divided into two groups. Group A, denoted by the pink, and Group B, colored by green. Group A community was distributed from the northern Bering Sea to the Chakti Sea near the Point Barrow. In contrast, Group B, colored by green, occurred at the station from the southwestern Beaufort Seas. The dominant diatoms clearly differed between these two diatom community groups. Open water species shown by the red were predominant in the diatom community group A, distributed in the northern Bering and Chakti Seas. On the other hand, ice-associated diatoms highly contributed to the community group B, which was mainly distributed in the southwestern Beaufort Seas. Interestingly, the environmental factors consistently reflect these characteristics of diatom communities. That is, the timing of the sea ice retreat was later. The growing period was longer in the diatom community group B, which is ice-associated diatom predominant. Therefore, the distribution and community composition of diatom-dwelling bloom would be significantly influenced by the presence of sea ice and the light environment in the Pacific Arctic region. Furthermore, this graphics shows the relationship between the timing of the sea ice retreat and growing periods of ice-associated diatoms and the proportion of ice-associated diatoms in communities. As this figure shows, the prevalence of ice-associated species was positively correlated with the timing of the sea ice retreat and the growing periods of the ice-associated diatoms. So we can say that the diatom composition follows the spatial patterns that depend upon the variable timing of the sea ice retreat and accompanying light conditions. Therefore, in the Pacific Arctic region, future changes in sea ice extent and duration can impact the diatom assemblages, and that resulting changes in primary productivity and community structure may affect other components of Arctic marine ecosystem. This slide is a summary of my study, and the sea ice dynamics can be the leading factor in the determining diatom species composition and duration in the Pacific Arctic region. And also the Pacific Arctic region could be sensitive to sea ice dynamics because the diatom assemblages switches depending on the timing of the sea ice retreat, which means in this region, the predominant diatoms dwelling blooms would be switching between the open water diatoms, ice-associated diatoms. That's all. Thank you for listening. If any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yuri. If there's any questions, please raise your hand or ask them in the chat. I have a quick question at least. So you talked about the different types of diatoms depending on the environmental conditions, but did you also, or can you also see whether there are changes in the total mass or prevalence of diatoms and the silicate usage?
Actually in this study, I'm not focusing on the total amount of the I mean the switching of the total amount, because I think the impact of the regional variability would be the main factor for determining the concentration of the diatoms in sediment. So I think it's difficult to assess the the amount of changes in the amount of the primary producer. But sorry, I can show the other studies results. Oh, there is no result showing the total abundance. Actually, I did the same studies on the Northern Pacific to compare the yearly changes. I compared with the distribution of the diatom concentration and composition between the 2017 and 2018. There is no result, but in my study, in the concentration of diatoms in sediment is much larger than in 2018 compared with the 2017. And the sea ice retreat is earlier in 2018. So that means if the sea ice retreat is longer, the growing periods of phytoplankton would become longer, and the deposition of the diatoms in sediment would be larger. But it's a case study, so I cannot say the general things, but I wanna mention sometimes I can catch we can figure out from the sediment.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Thank you. Any more questions for Yuri? Well, maybe I have one more. So, can you also look at the diatom assemblages in the sediments sort of back in time, so you can maybe construct a time series from the sediment record and relate that to sea ice boxes? Would that be possible?
Oh, so you mean I will take samples vertically
Yeah, so you
of
look
the
down,
sediment core.
down.
I'm not sure, because the diatom resting stages also have a life. Sorry, how to say? The amount of the diatom resting stage is decreasing year by year. They also dead year by year.
Yeah, so you can't look
So,
at.
but my idea is if using some first two of the, identify the, if we can identify from the first two.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we could be the compare the relationship.
That would be nice. Okay, I can't see any hands, so any questions in the chat. So thank you, Yuri, and thank you again to Jakob and Zhangxian for very nice presentations. Thank you. And I think the only thing left for today is to say that we are planning the first SAS webinar for the fall. I think me and Maria, we discussed that today, and September 23rd. Yes, September 23rd. So if anybody here on the call are interested in presenting the research, then just send an email to Maria, and we will put you on the list of speakers, potential speakers. Okay, that's it. So have a wonderful day, afternoon, or night, wherever you are. Okay, bye-bye.